Hi, and thank you for joining me. Today, I'm going to be creating a create handler in our REST API using Zend Expressive. So stick around and we'll get right on that. All right, so we're going to be, as I said, we're going to create a create handler for our REST API using Zend Expressive. Now, you may recall in previous videos, if you haven't seen those, please go back and view those. I'll also put it up here. And go back and see and create the project. It will really be informative to get some hands-on with it. So that being said, we have our Docker container up and running. We can see that that it's working here. We have Zend Expressive Web and Expressive DB. Those are our containers that we're using for this, and also have our terminal up here. So what we want to do first off is we're going to be making API calls. Now, in previous videos, I had used the HTTP client that is part of PhpStorm. However, they have a new thing in PhpStorm, and that is using files to actually execute your HTTP calls. So, to do that, if I expand scratches in consoles and expand scratches down here, I have a couple of files created. One is announcements-get http and announcements-post.http. Now I've renamed those to make sense. So basically, if we open up one of these, we'll see that there's a couple get commands in here. One is just a get /announcements, and of course I'm accepting application JSON as the response. And if I execute that, just simply by running it, we'll see that it actually makes an HTTP call, and we get back the response as if we were using the HTTP client before. So we can see our Hypermedia that we'd created previously, and as well as the data being returned. Now I have a second call in this file that is basically calling the same thing, but it's adding the command for or the argument for page 2 on the end. And if I execute that, we'll see that it actually does the same thing, makes the same call, but we get back the second page of results. So we can see our request, we can see our header information, we can see what we get back. This of course is page 2 because that's what we requested, and we can see that there are a total of 3 pages. And I can edit the file to make that call different. Now, we're going to be using that here coming up because we're going to be making more calls, but in this case, we're going to be making a post. Now, our post is very simple. It's just calling the same endpoint /announcements. It's making content type of application /JSON, and of course, we have some JSON that we're passing here in the body of the request. Now, currently, that will not succeed because we haven't yet created the create handler. So we're going to do that. Now, if I expand out our application, search, look at handlers, right now we have a read handler factory and a read handler, but we want to create the create handler. So to do that, I'm going to click over to the terminal here. Now in the terminal, I can issue a command and use the CLI tooling in Zend Expressive. And so let's issue a command. So if I do composer expressive list, and it'll run the command and actually bring back a list of different commands that are available through the Zend Expressive tooling. One of those commands is being able to create a handler. So we have the handler :create is one of the commands that we can use. So we're going to do that, and what we're going to do is we're going to issue the command composer expressive, and we're going to pass expressive that command handler -create. Now, as part of the handler create, we need to give it a namespace and tell it what we want. We want to tell it the handler that we want it to create. So we're going to go ahead and put that in. Now, of course, we're using the module announcements. So if I do announcements, and of course I have to put in / so that way it properly escapes as it's being created. We want to do handler, and then we want to create a handler create handler, or announcements create handler rather. Announcements create handler, and that is the command. So once we have that command, we can hit enter, and now it tells us that it created our create handler. Now it did an additional step here that the tooling does, is when it creates a handler, it also creates a factory for the handler. And so let's minimize this. We'll take a look, and sure enough, there are our new files. So we have the create handler factory and the create handler for announcements. And so those have been created. And now, one of the things that we want to do then is, let's go in and edit the factory. Actually, before we do that, I like to, in my entities, I like to create a little, another method in my entities. And basically that, the method that I like to create is an easy way to set the item that I'm adding to. So in my database, I want to create an announcement, but rather than my handlers doing all the setters and taking advantage of all the setters, I usually create one method that allows me to set do all the setters. So that way I don't have to redo that all the time. So if I scroll down here, and right before I get to my getters, I'm going to create a method, and that method is going to be my set announcement method. All right, so let's go ahead and put that in here. So I'm creating a set announcement method, and that set announcement method is expecting the request body to be passed in array format, and by doing that is taking advantage of all the other setters inside the entity. So I'm doing, I'm adding sort, I'm adding content, I'm adding the date time for the modified. I'm taking advantage of another item here, which is the isActive. And basically I'm creating a condition to say, if it's set in the request body, go ahead and use it. If it's not set in the request body, set it to active from the beginning, right? So the default will be active. Okay, so now I've created that method, so now I can actually use the set announcement method outside of the entity to very quickly set an announcement simply by passing it a request body. So that we've got that done, so I'm going to go ahead and now I want to go into the factory. And let's see. Well, prior to doing that, I wanted to make one note. As we're creating using the Zend tooling, one of the files that are created is in our config. It creates this Zend Expressive tooling factories. And if we click into that, we see that there are in fact two entries in here. One for our read handler that we created long ago in previous videos, and one that we just now created, which is our announcements create handler. And the tooling creates this for us. Now, if you are not using the tooling, and if you're doing these things manually, then in your ConfigProvider for the module, you would want to create those. And in the past, I have created my read handler factory here, and I could just as easily right now go ahead and for my create handler, I could just simply copy and paste that in. Oop. Yep. Somehow I copied in an empty string. So let me go back over there and copy this. And then we will paste it in. There we go. And so now this is what your config provider would look like if you were not using the tooling, if you were creating these things manually. Now, in my case, I'll just leave it in there for the sake of having it, but I could just as easily comment these ones out because I've got them in my config provider already. But anyway, so the Zend Expressive tooling does create this for you. I prefer to keep things in my module, so that's why I'm putting them in the config provider within the module. So that way my factories related to that module are within the module versus being set globally. I don't really necessarily like the idea of doing them globally, but the tooling does that just to kind of help out a little bit. All right, so now that we've got our kind of some groundwork laid, right? We created the set announcement method in our entity. We've got our config provider updated so that way it knows about the factories. Now that we've got that, we can now go in and do some customization of our factory. So we're going to open up the factory, the announcement create handler factory, and in there. Really the only addition that we need to make is our return, right? Because we're going to be calling the announcements create handler. But there's a couple of arguments that we want to add in there. And so that way it's going to work as we expect. One of those is the entity manager. And then we also want to pass in the how response factory as well as the resource generator. Now, you may recall in a previous episode, we were creating the how through automated methods. So we were using Zend Expressive how, the Zend Expressive how component, and in that component then we were using that component to create our how automatically. So that's why we've got these second two items that we're passing in, because we want to continue using the how through automated methods even in the create handler. Now, one of the things that I do need to do is I'm going to go ahead and just automate this a little bit. And allow the yeah. All right. So I'm just letting PhpStorm automatically generate these for me. All right, so now I've got the how response factory and the resource generator, and now I've let PhpStorm populate those use statements for me by backspacing a little bit and then just going continuing forward. All right, so now of course PhpStorm is telling us that our announcements create handler is a little bit off because it doesn't know about these three arguments yet. So let's go ahead and click over to the create handler. And now we've got to update the handler with the new arguments for one, and also with the contents of the create handler. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do in the create handler, of course, we're expecting a post request in our create handler, and as part of a post request, we're going to need to parse the body of that request so that we can get our the data that we're expecting to get in. Now, by default, in Zend Expressive, we need to add a middleware to handle that. So I'm going to go into my pipelines, and in the pipelines, I need to add in a new item, and that is allowing my BodyParamsMiddleware to do its job. So I'm going to go ahead and add that down here. And so what that is I'm piping in now the BodyParamsMiddleware, and let me go ahead and there. So now we've got that. And so BodyParamsMiddleware, is going to be included in. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to go ahead and bring this in as a use statement instead of having the full path here. So I'm going to paste that in just like that. So now we can, that's imported in, and we're able to use just a short name here. All right, so now we've got the BodyParamsMiddleware as a middleware being available inside of our application, and we did that by including it in our pipeline. So now I can actually use that here. Now there's a few things that I also need to do here. One is now I need to enable the create handler to have some fields. We need to have some fields in here, and having these fields available. Oh, so we need to do entity manager, because that's one of the things that we're sending in, or we're expecting. And we also want to have our how response factory. All right, so we have our how response factory, and we're also going to do our resource generator. Okay, so we've got those three fields here now, because of course we're going to need these items to generate the response. So now to populate those, and we're going to have to add in a constructor. So I'm going to bring in public function construct, and in the constructor we're going to populate those. But first off, we need to add them in here. So we have the entity manager, and because we're going to type into entity manager and entity manager just like that. And our second item is the how response factory. And the third item is the resource generator. All right, so now we've got our three arguments being expected in our constructor. And now we need to populate our fields with those items. So we have this in entity manager, and we're going to use entity manager to populate that, and same thing for the how response factory. All right, it's the second one, and of course we want to do the resource generator, and we're going to use resource generator for that. All right, so now we have a constructor that is now going to populate these three fields with the data being passed into it as it's being called through the factory. All right, so now we have those. So now the next thing we need to do is start fleshing out our handle method, right? One of the items we need to do then is pull in. So we want to pull in our request body, and keep in mind, much as we did before, earlier we had included in the parsed body in our middleware, right? So here's where we're going to use that. We're going to create a temporary variable request body. We're going to, from the request, we're going to then do get parsed body, and we're looking for, in this case, I'm looking for array items request announcements, because the body is going to be parsed. So it's going to be, it's expecting JSON coming in, and it's going to parse it. And as such, it's going to create an array of request announcements. Now, the body that you're expecting to come into your application might be slightly different. This is just the way I'm creating this one for clarity. So we're expecting an array item for request, and in there we're going to have a subarray item for announcements, and then we're going to parse that. Now, if the request body is empty, so meaning that somebody tried to do a request and there was nothing in the body for us to use, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to return a new JSON response with the result of 400. We're going to return a 400 error. Now, in this case, we're Yep, that's going to be fine. So, so we have that. So we're expecting that, and we're going to return back an error if we don't have a request body, because of course we can't do a create if we don't have the request body. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to be working with the announcements entity. So we need to create the announcements entity, and that's the next thing that we're going to do here. Is we're gonna create a temporary variable entity, and we're expecting it to create a new announcement. Now I'm gonna backspace here just a little bit because I want to pull that in. All right, so I used PhpStorm's automatic generation again by backspacing, and now I pulled in the announcement. All right, so now we have the entity being created. Now, the things we want to do is we want to take advantage of the method that we created in the entity to set the announcement. So we're going to do that now. Now, what I'm going to do, the way that I'm doing this is I'm going to create a try-catch block, right? So create a try-catch block. And in this try-catch block, first I'm going to take the entity, I'm going to use the set announcement method that we just created, and I'm going to pass it the request body that we just parsed, right? And then, of course, I'm also going to set created through the entity. Now, that set created, I'm doing that separately rather than doing it in the set announcement because I want to set it to now. Now, we don't always use the set announcement will not always need to add created, the created date, because in some cases the set announcement might be getting used for updating a record versus creating a record. So that's why I leave that as a separate item in my entities, and I want to do that on purpose. So I want to create set created on purpose. And then, of course, I'm going to use the entity manager that we've already passed in through our constructor, and we're going to persist. We're going to pass it the entity, and then we're going to issue flush, which actually performs the act of creating the record. Now, if all of this fails, we're going to call the ORM exception, and we're going to call the ORM exception as an error, and then we're going to create a JSON response with the result, which is going to be the error that it witnessed, and that's going to be passed as a 400 status code. All right, so now we've got that. Now, one of the things I'm noticing here is that we don't have this one, so there. All right. I needed to use JSON response, was not finding JSON response, so I had to let PhpStorm create that. And there's an unhandled exception in the set created, but we should be fine with that. All right, so now that's our try-catch block. So now we've got everything we need, except we're not really returning anything on success. So I do want to return something on success because at the minimum I want to create or put out the how. I want to put out the hypermedia, so that way the API is more complete and it allows users to know what they're able to do. So we're going to add in the resource. We're going to use the resource generator. We're pulling from the object, which is being kicked back from the entity. And we're passing it the request, and then we're returning the how response factory create response by using the request and the resource to do that. All right, so now we've got everything created here. I'm seeing PhpStorm is not liking the set created because it's thinking there should be an exception put there, but I'm thinking we might still be okay. So what I'm going to do now that I've created this create handler, I'm now going to open up my HTTP file for the announcements post that I showed you earlier, and we're going to execute that. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to, you can see the request announcements here, and then the announcement itself, we're passing in a sort of 10, and we're adding in content, which is just saying this is a sample announcement. And I'm going to go ahead and execute that, and let's see if it crashes or succeeds. Okay, there was an internal server error. All right, so as it turns out, we had an error in our ConfigProvider. So in the ConfigProvider, when I copied and pasted over the items in, I had this announcements at the beginning. I don't need that here because, of course, the ConfigProvider is actually inside the module, so we didn't need to create those. And then I've got a couple of unneeded things up here. They wouldn't cause errors, but there's no sense in having them there. So now, once I have that cleaned up, now I can kick off the post and it works correctly. Then I'm getting back the 200 response, I'm getting back my data. It created the record, so as it created the record, it actually outputs the information for the record, and I'm also getting my Hypermedia telling me what the URL would be in another request to then view the announcements. So everything worked, other than just the little snafu with the ConfigProvider, that little error there. And that's all I have. So I hope you find this useful for creating extra handlers inside Zend Expressive. In this case, we created a create handler. And please, if you watch the video and go down below, add some comments, tell me what you thought of the video. Also, give me some feedback. Tell me what you might want me to create in the future. And I thank you for coming. Take care.